The sun had already begun its slow crawl across the sky, burning down on the dry, cracked earth. She stumbled forward, each step heavier than the last, her bare feet cutting into the hot sand. Dust clung to her skin and clothes, her hair matted and streaked with sweat. Her body was exhausted, her throat raw and aching, and the smell of the desert was sharp and suffocating. She had been walking for hours, maybe days, driven by a single thought: water. But not just water, clean water she could use to wash, too. Feel human again, even for a moment. Every instinct screamed at her to stop, to collapse into the sand. But desperation pushed her forward in the distance. She saw a faint shimmer metal wood and firelight flickering against the horizon. A human settlement. Her heart leapt with hope, but fear followed immediately. Humans were dangerous. She did not know them, and they might see her as a threat. And yet, the thought of standing in a warm shower, letting water rinse away the dirt, and exhaustion made her take another step, and then another, ignoring the pain in her feet and the burn in her throat. The desert wind whipped her hair into her face, stinging her eyes with grit, but she pressed on. Crouching low behind rocks and dunes, whenever she thought someone might see her, the closer she got, the more details emerged. A small house, faint. Smoke rising from a chimney, a fence surrounding the yard. Dogs barked somewhere inside, sharp and angry, warning her silently that the humans were alert. Her pulse quickened.
Ow!
Each movement had to be calculated, every shadow used to her advantage. She studied the fence. Noting gaps and weak points, she noticed the dogs' positions and the way the light from the windows swung over the yard. Her heart pounded, every breath shallow. Every muscle taut with tension. Night began to fall, but the desert still radiated heat from the day. She moved like a shadow, careful, deliberate. One false step could alert the dogs, or worse, the humans themselves. The smell of smoke from the chimney grew stronger, and with it, the lure of water and warmth. She crouched behind a low wall, her eyes fixed on a small side door that might offer entry. Every sound, the shuffle of a dog, a creak. From the house, even the wind made her freeze. But the need to wash, to reclaim some piece of humanity, overpowered fear. Slowly, cautiously, she crept closer. The fence proved to be the first challenge. The metal wires bit into her palms as she pushed through a small gap. Pain flared, but she ignored it. The dog stirred, sniffing the air, growling low in the shadows. Her heart threatened to explode, but she forced herself to move steadily, pressing close to the ground, letting the darkness hide her. Step by step, she advanced until the side door was only a few feet away. Her hands shook as she reached for the handle, half expecting it to be locked, half expecting a human to jump out and shout. The door opened with a quiet groan. She slipped inside, breath held, ears straining. The interior smelled of firewood, cooked food, and cleanliness, everything the desert had denied her. Relief washed over her, but she knew it could vanish in an instant. A dog growled somewhere sharp and close. She froze, instinctively pressing herself against the wall. From somewhere inside, footsteps approached, careful and deliberate. Swallowed hard, heart hammering in her chest. Then a human appeared, lantern in hand. His eyes caught hers in the dim light, sharp and assessing. She froze, holding up her hands in the universal gesture of peace. "Water, please," she whispered, her voice cracked and dry. Stared, silent and cautious, the dog's growl softening. Slightly, slowly, he nodded, setting the lantern down and moving to fetch a jug of water. She took it eagerly, cupping her hands, drinking deeply, letting the cool liquid wash over her dry lips. Relief surged through her, a lifeline returned in each gulp. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of safety. The desert still waited outside, harsh and unforgiving, but here, in this small human home, she had a chance not just to survive, but to reclaim a small piece of herself. Her hands still trembled, her body aching, but the water had done more than quench thirst. It had given her hope, and in the quiet between gulps, she realized that survival was no longer only about water. It was about courage, about stepping into danger for a chance to feel human again, and about the fragile trust she now shared with a stranger in this unforgiving world. The house was quiet now, except for the faint crackle of the fire in the hearth, and the soft breathing of the dog somewhere in the corner, which crouched low, heart racing, eyes scanning every shadow. The water she had drunk brought life back to her body, but it also sharpened her senses, reminding her that danger was still near. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the walls, made her freeze, muscles tight with tension. She had come this far, risked everything to enter, and now every move had to be precise. One misstep, one sound, and the fragile trust she had glimpsed could shatter in an instant. Slowly she pressed forward, sticking close to the walls, using shadows to hide her form. Her bare feet barely made a sound on the wooden floor as she edged toward the kitchen, she remembered. The jug of water the human had offered, and now her attention shifted to the sink and the basin nearby. If she could wash, even just a little, it would feel like reclaiming a small piece of herself, a fragment of dignity stolen by the desert. Her hands shook as she reached the kitchen, careful not to knock over any objects, careful not to alert the dog. The dog stirred, low growl vibrating in its throat. She froze, breath caught in her chest, and pressed herself even closer to the wall. Its eyes, glowing faintly in the firelight, followed her every movement. Panic surged for a moment, threatening to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to stay, still moving only when the growl subsided. The human remained nearby, silently watching, lantern casting long shadows. His presence was both a comfort and a tension, a reminder that she was not alone, but also under scrutiny. Finally, she reached the sink. The water inside was clear, cool, and fragrant, a miracle after days of dust and thirst. She dipped her hands, carefully letting the water run over her skin, washing away layers of grime and sweat. Relief washed over her, and she inhaled deeply, savoring the smell and feel of clean water. For a moment, she let herself forget the dangers outside, forgetting the desert, the risk, the humans who might turn hostile. In that brief respite, she felt almost human again, but the quiet did not last. The floorboards creaked, and she froze once more. The human had moved closer, eyes sharp and calculating. She lifted her hands slowly, showing she meant no harm, lips trembling as she whispered, "I just wash, please." His expression softened slightly, but he did not move immediately. The dog's growl grew lower, a warning that still held tension in the room. She remained calm, careful, showing patience and humility. Survival here was not only about water, it was about reading every subtle sign, every expression, every breath. Finally, the human stepped aside, nodding toward the basin. She moved closer, dipping her hands and then her face, feeling the coolness flow over her tired body. Every drop of water was a small victory, a reclamation of life, a silent triumph over the desert that had tested her so cruelly. The dog's growl softened completely, and she realized the fragile trust was extending not only from the human, but even to the creature that could have easily torn her away as she washed. She noted small details in the house, the careful arrangement of objects, the signs of daily life, the simple organization that had kept this place functioning in the harsh desert. Each observation strengthened her understanding, each lesson silently teaching her how to survive here. Trust was fragile, but necessary. Cooperation was not optional. It was essential for her life. And in these small acts, washing, observing, and breathing, she felt a connection to this strange, unfamiliar world. Night deepened and the wind outside whispered against the walls. She finished washing, feeling renewed but cautious, every muscle still tensed, every sense alert. She looked at the human, then at the dog, sensing that their lives were now entwined, however tentatively. Outside, the desert waited, endless and unforgiving, but inside, she had found a small sanctuary, a momentary reprieve. And she knew that survival would demand more than water or shelter. It would demand courage, careful choices, and the delicate balance of trust she had begun to build. The fire flickered in the corner of the small room, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. She stood near the basin, hands still wet, every nerve in her body alert. The human watched her quietly, lantern held low, his eyes sharp and calculating. The dog had settled a few feet away, but remained watchful, ears twitching at every sound. The moment was thick with tension. One wrong movement, one sudden sound, and the fragile trust she had begun to build could vanish in an instant. She knew that survival here was not just about finding water. It was about understanding the silent rules of this house, of this stranger's world, and respecting them. She lifted her eyes to meet his voice, barely a whisper. Think. Water. Wash. The words were simple, broken, but full of gratitude and desperation. He did not speak immediately, only studied her carefully. Every line of his face, every slight movement spoke of caution, of experience, of someone who had survived this harsh world and learned when to act and when to wait. She understood that she had to show respect, humility, and patience. Slowly, she gestured toward the basin, indicating that all she wanted was to clean herself, nothing more. The human nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement of her intent. He moved to the side, keeping a careful distance, but close enough to observe. To ensure the safety of his home and the dog, she began to wash, hands trembling slightly as the cool water flowed over her skin. Dust and sweat ran down her arms and face, dissolving into the basin, leaving her feeling almost reborn. Each movement was careful, deliberate, as if performing a ritual of survival and respect. The dog's low growl had vanished, replaced by a soft, watchful sniffing, as if acknowledging her peaceful intent. Time seemed to stretch the small room, filled only with the sounds of water dripping, the soft crackle of the fire, and the quiet breathing of the human. She could feel the weight of his gaze, but it was not threatening, merely alert, measuring, understanding. Trust had not fully formed, but it was being tested, built slowly in these silent exchanges. She realized that survival here required more than courage. It required reading the smallest signals, recognizing intention, and moving carefully within boundaries she had yet to fully understand. As she finished washing, she noticed a small towel neatly folded on a nearby shelf. She picked it up, drying her arms and face with slow, deliberate motions, careful not to draw sudden attention. The human watched, expression calm, but still alert. Finally, she met his gaze again, silent thanks in her eyes. The unspoken message passed between them. She had come in desperation, she had respected the rules, and now she had earned a measure of safety. The dog shifted slightly, easing closer to her without aggression, a sign that the human had accepted her, at least tentatively. Wind outside howled faintly against the house, a reminder that the desert's dangers had not vanished. They remained outside, waiting, watching, ever present. She realized that she could not linger too long, that survival would demand movement, awareness, and continued caution. But inside the small, flickering lit room, she had found a fragile repriever, place to wash, to breathe, to regain a piece of her humanity. The human finally spoke, voice low and steady. "You are not safe out there, but you are careful. That is important." His words were simple, but carried a weight of truth. She nodded, understanding. The desert was merciless, but cautious. Humble movements could carve small spaces of safety if one knew how to act. For the first time since she had entered this house, she felt not only relief but a spark of connection, the beginning of trust that could sustain her through the harsh world outside, even as she packed her few belongings. Preparing to move again, she knew this encounter had changed something fundamental. Survival was no longer only about water or hiding. It was about understanding, about patience, and about recognizing the fragile humanity that could exist even in a stranger. She stepped back from the basin, wiping the last drops of water from her hands, feeling lighter, cleaner, and cautiously hopeful. Outside, the desert waited, vast and unforgiving. But inside the quiet room, beside the watchful human and the patient dog, she had found a brief moment of safety, And in that fleeting moment, she understood something vital. Sometimes survival was not just about escaping danger, but about entering it, carefully reading it, finding a way to coexist, if only for a few precious hours. The night air pressed heavily against the walls of the small house, carrying the faint scent of sand and dust from the desert beyond. She and the human had settled into a fragile rhythm, she washing, resting, observing, and he watching quietly, ready to intervene if danger came too close. For a moment, it seemed the harsh world outside had paused, allowing this brief reprieve. But the desert had its own rules, and no safety was permanent. The wind whispered against the windows, carrying the hint of a storm, something far more dangerous. Suddenly, a sharp noise shattered the silence. A loud, scraping, mechanical and deliberate, came from outside. The dog barked sharply, ears pinned back in alert. She froze instantly, body pressed to the floor, heart hammering. The human's hand went to the lantern, raising it just enough to glance through a window. Shadows moved against the sand, large and unfamiliar, figures that did not belong to the ordinary desert creatures. Fear surged through her, but so did adrenaline. Survival demanded quick thinking, precise movement, and calm under pressure. "Stay low," the human whispered, voice firm but calm. "Do not make a sound. They are close." She nodded, pressed herself against the wall, and held her breath. The desert had brought them here, but now it brought something else, a threat neither of them had anticipated. The mechanical scraping grew louder, accompanied by a faint hum, signaling the approach of strange machines or scavengers, drawn perhaps by the light of the house or the smell of water. Every instinct screamed at her to run. She knew that running without a plan would be fatal. The human moved carefully, his eyes scanning the room. Then the windows, noting every shadow, every movement. He gestured for her to follow him too. A narrow corner where they could be partially hidden. They crouched side by side, silent, every muscle taut, listening to the scraping and the hum. The dog growled low, but remained still, sensing the tension, a silent partner in their shared danger. For the first time, she felt the full weight of reliance, not just on her own instincts, but on someone else's experience and judgment. Trust was no longer optional. It was the thin line between life and death. Minutes stretched, feeling like hours as the noise drew closer. The desert's harsh night had become alive with threat. She watched as the human whispered small, precise instructions, guiding her movements, signaling when to shift slightly, when to stay perfectly still. Every action had meaning. Every misstep could bring disaster. Her body ached, but fear sharpened her senses, heightening every detail, the glint of metal in the moonlight, the way the sand shifted under weight, the quiet scrape against a distant rock. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise receded. Figures moved away from the house, leaving the desert heavy with silence once more. The dog relaxed slightly, growl fading to cautious sniffing, and the human lowered his hand from the lantern. Relief washed over her, mingled with the rush of adrenaline, leaving her drained but alive. In that intense moment, she realized something vital. Survival was never just about water or shelter. It was about awareness, adaptability, and trust. She had depended on him completely, and he had guided her safely through the immediate danger. As the night wore on, the desert settled back into its quiet rhythm, but the lesson remained. They had faced the threat together, relying on each other. In ways neither could have managed alone, a bond had deepened, forged not in comfort, but in fear and necessity. She cleaned herself further, careful and deliberate, understanding that survival required more than just quenching thirst, demanded cooperation, patience, and attention to every detail. By dawn, they were both alert but calmer. The immediate danger had passed, yet the desert promised more trials. She looked at the human, and in his steady gaze, she saw approval and recognition of her growing skills. She was no longer merely a desperate intruder. She had proven she could adapt, follow, instructions, and survive under pressure. The shared threat had transformed fear into cautious respect, and she knew their fragile alliance had strengthened. The desert outside remained vast, unforgiving, and full of unseen dangers. Yet inside the small house she felt a spark of confidence. The human, the dog, and she had survived together, navigating the peril with precision and silent communication. She understood that the night had changed her. Not only had she survived, but she had learned the deeper rules of this harsh world. Trust, observation, and courage were the true tools of survival. And as the first light of morning began to filter through the windows, she realized that the world outside was still dangerous. But together, they had discovered a way to face it. The shared threat had not just tested them, it had prepared them for whatever came next, forging a connection that might one day be stronger than the desert itself. The morning sun climbed slowly over the desert, painting the sand with warm gold and deep orange. She stood near the doorway, drying her hair with a small worn cloth, her movements careful and deliberate. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on her mind, the scraping machines, the growling dog, the tense moments when every step could have been her last. Yet, through that danger, a fragile trust had formed between her and the human. For the first time since she had entered the house, she felt that survival here was not just about water, shelter, or avoiding the desert. It was about understanding and relying on another being. The human watched her quietly, the lantern still faintly glowing, a silent reminder that even in safety, vigilance was necessary. He had taught her more than just the rules of the house. He had shown her patience, observation, and caution. Every instruction he gave, every subtle signal had helped her navigate danger without faltering. She realized now that these lessons were as important as the water she had craved. Survival required cooperation, respect, and humility. Trust was not given lightly in this world. It was earned, and it had to be maintained with care. As she moved through the small house, organizing her meager belongings and preparing for the next journey, she reflected on her own choices. The desert had forced her to be brave, to take risks she might never have imagined. Sneaking into a stranger's home had been terrifying, yet necessary. Drinking water, washing her hands and face, had restored more than her body it had restored, her sense of self. And now, she understood that her survival depended not only on physical strength, but on judgment, patience, and the courage to trust someone who had no obligation to help her. The human approached, holding a small container of water for the journey ahead. "You've learned quickly," he said, his voice calm but carrying weight. Not everyone would survive the desert or the choices they must make here. She accepted the water, nodding silently, feeling the bond between them grow stronger. Each sip reminded her that survival was no longer solitary, it was shared. Every glance, every silent exchange had meaning, and she had learned to read them carefully. Outside, the wind stirred the sand, reminding them both that the desert was never forgiving. But together, they had found a way to move through it cautiously, each protecting the other, each learning from the other. She realized that trust had become a tool for survival as vital as water. It required patience, understanding, and awareness. The desert had tested her not just physically, but mentally and emotionally, shaping her into someone capable of navigating both danger and relationships. By midday, she and the human were ready to leave the house, prepared for the journey that awaited. The desert was vast, unforgiving, and unpredictable, but they had learned lessons that would carry them through: to observe carefully, to act with purpose, and to rely on each other when danger struck. The bond formed in those tense hours of night and morning had changed her perspective. She was no longer merely desperate, merely struggling to survive. She was learning, adapting, and growing stronger with every step. As they stepped outside, the sun hot against their skin, she glanced back at the house, the small sanctuary where water, trust, and understanding had intertwined. It had been more than a shelter. It had been a classroom, a proving ground. She understood now that survival was not only about escaping immediate threats, but about learning the deeper patterns of life in this harsh desert. Cooperation, patience, and trust had become her weapons, and she carried them forward with the same care as the water in her hands. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, full of unknown dangers, but for the first time she felt prepared. Beside her had shown her the way not just to survive, but to navigate a world where every decision mattered. Together, they moved forward, stepping carefully over the hot sand, trusting not only in each other, but in the lessons learned through fear, risk, and quiet observation. And as the wind blew against them, carrying the scent of dust and promise, she realized that this journey was more than survival. It was a transformation, a slow awakening to the power of trust and the strength it could give in a world that demanded vigilance and courage. The desert stretched endlessly under the early morning sun, a vast sea of gold and red that shimmered and shifted with every breath of wind. She stood beside the human, their shadows stretching long across the sand. Bodies tired but alert, hearts still racing from the night's dangers. The small house behind them had faded into the distance, a temporary sanctuary, a place where water, trust, and survival had intertwined. Now the true journey began, a path through a world that demanded courage, observation, and cooperation at every step. She carried only what she could hold, the lessons of the desert etched into her movements and thoughts. Every step was deliberate, cautious, yet filled with a new confidence. She had survived the harsh night, navigated the stranger's house, and earned a measure of trust that had seemed impossible when she first approached the settlement. Now she understood that survival was not merely avoiding danger or finding water. It was about understanding the world, understanding others, and learning to move with care and awareness in every moment. The human beside her walked silently, eyes scanning the horizon, every muscle ready to respond to threats she could barely imagine. She had learned to follow his lead, to read his subtle signals, to anticipate danger before it arrived. The dog trotted at a careful distance, ears alert, a reminder that even in moments of apparent safety, vigilance was essential. The desert was unforgiving, but she had begun to see its patterns, its rules, and the fragile spaces where survival was possible. As they moved, she glanced at the human, noticing small signs of patience and trust. He had guided her through peril, without words, had assessed her intentions, had allowed her to reclaim a small piece of dignity with water and shelter. She realized that their connection was not just a matter of chance. It was a necessary alliance, born from shared need, respect, and courage. In a world as harsh as this, such connections were rare, precious, and powerful. They came to a small rise, the wind carrying dust and distant sounds. She paused, feeling the vastness of the desert pressing against her, yet not feeling helpless. Every step, every breath, every cautious movement had strengthened her. She was no longer just a desperate wanderer. She had become someone capable of surviving, learning, and even thriving in a world that had once seemed impossible. The desert had tested her, shaped her, now prepared her for whatever lay ahead. The human stopped and looked at her, silently asking if she was ready. She nodded, a small but firm gesture, and together they continued. The horizon stretched endlessly, a challenge and a promise. They did not speak. Much words were unnecessary. Each step communicated understanding. Each glance carried meaning. Each careful motion was proof of shared purpose. The desert remained dangerous, full of hidden threats and uncertainty. But they had discovered a rhythm, a partnership that allowed them to face the unknown with courage. Hours passed as they moved steadily forward, sand shifting beneath their feet, sun climbing higher in the sky. She felt the first real sense of freedom she had known in days. The desert was still vast and relentless, but she had allies, knowledge, and a growing confidence. She understood now that survival was more than avoiding immediate danger. It was about reading the world, understanding relationships, and finding strength in connection. Each moment of caution, each act of trust, each careful decision had led her to this point, a new path, uncertain but filled with possibility. By evening, they found a small, sheltered area, a place to rest before continuing. She knelt, letting the dust settle from her clothes. Feeling the day's sun warm her skin, and looked at the human beside her. A silent bond had formed, deeper than fear, stronger than desperation. They had faced the desert together, navigated threats, shared knowledge, and now moved forward into the unknown with hope rather than panic. And as the stars began to emerge, glittering against the darkening sky, she realized that this was only the beginning. The desert would always demand vigilance, courage, and trust. But she had discovered the power of partnership, the strength in careful observation, and the resilience within herself. She had stepped into danger, survived, and emerged stronger. The path ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time, she felt ready to walk it not alone, but together with someone she had come to rely on, someone she trusted, someone who had become more than a stranger in the vast, unforgiving desert. The journey was not over. The desert was still dangerous, but she was no longer powerless. She was clean, alert, aware, and armed with the knowledge that courage, trust, and careful action could carve a path even through the harshest world. And with that realization, she took the next step, ready to face whatever came next, her resolve steady, her spirit unbroken, and her heart quietly strengthened by the bond she had earned and the lessons she had learned.